Just what is going on with him now? The High Matriarch, Madame Tua, asked herself, as she surveyed the constantly incoming intelligence about James's whereabouts. Just what was he thinking? Rolling along the rails of public transit, making a huge show out of it for everyone to see. Had he any idea about the amount of work it would take to keep this situation under control with him pulling stunts like this? Surely he knew that this wouldn't win him anything. Even more concerning was the question of, just where is he going? And what was the warrant officer thinking? Contact with Reprieve and the rest of his team had been cut quite a while ago, and from the reports it didn't sound like that happened voluntarily. However, now it seemed like the man was going along with James surprisingly willingly, as no attempt of his to so much as resist his current situation was reported. Of course, logic would suggest that the officer probably had a weapon pointed at him at the current time, but could that really explain him running along with the primate? Tua lifted her trunk to rub over her face. She had squinted her eyes so much in the last hour or so that their muscles were starting to ache from the strain, and they weren't the only ones. Her entire body carried an annoying tension. After this, she would have to hastily make an appointment for some relaxation with a hot water massage, maybe even an entire spa trip. She deserved something after putting this much effort into this. Someone else could handle the aftermath, after she had done all the hard work. Then again, she would have liked to be there and see things play out once the pieces could finally start falling into place. Maybe just a quick appointment would do. An hour or so, just to get everything smoothed up again. Wait, what was she doing? She blinked a few times before looking back down at her screens. Right, James. Luckily, even though he waved that gun around like a madman, he hadn't actually so much as tried to shoot anyone yet. Had he done so, it would have been extraordinarily difficult to try and justify the no lethal shots order that was still in power at the time. Well, he didn't make things easier for her, by any stretch of the imagination. At least he wasn't being unbearably difficult, either. The second she had made clear that she was being serious, he had dropped his little rebellion in gravity control, just in time to still be able to smooth things over, even with some moderate difficulty. She had to admit, beneath her annoyance at his residence, she did feel a modicum of admiration for his resourcefulness and youthful zeal. It made her wonder, how much of it was human, and how much of it was James Aldwin? They had wanted an exceptional species for their purposes, and truly, the will had given them one. So many had given up hope already, but here they were. The very catalyst needed to tip the balance and bring much-needed change to the community. Tua's ears fluttered at the thought. She was getting almost giddy. What had she been doing again? She was getting so distractible after a day of work. Not that it mattered. Right, James. Looking at the way he currently seemed to be going, there were a few plausible destinations for his next move. At any rate, he was heading deeper into the better secured part of the station, making her job all the easier. Could it be that he was actually coming her way? Was he going to take her up on the invite she had expressed earlier? It was certainly possible, and quite exciting. There was a good chance, of course, that he wasn't going to arrive with any peaceful intentions, but she also really did not need him to. When he came here at all, that was all she could ask of him for the moment. Well, that wasn't quite true. She could ask a lot more. It would make many things easier, but she wasn't picky. Thinking of it, it had been a while since they last spoke. And he also wasn't holed up in his hidey hole anymore. Maybe she should give him another call. Chances were that he'd pick up again, and even if he didn't, it really could not hurt to try. Skimming through the contact information on her computer, she looked for that elusive call that had been forwarded to her earlier once again. Taking a moment to take up her professional demeanour, she activated the contact, allowing the computer to try and build up a connection. It ran for a while, and then a while longer, and it seemed that nobody was going to pick up. However, just as she was ready to resign to the fact that James wasn't yet ready to talk to her again, and started to reach for the end call icon, there was a change. "What is going on?" Moore asked loudly, as Sheila had nearly jumped out of her boots when James's phone had suddenly come to life in her pocket, as they were still trying to move through the station unnoticed. "I don't know, it just suddenly started doing that," Sheila replied defensively, holding the device between two fingers as it aggressively vibrated, insistently trying to get her, or anyone's attention. "I think someone's calling," Curie unhelpfully informed, as they interestedly eyed the thing's screen, which had changed to a different display, showing signs and letters completely unfamiliar to any of them. "I figured," Sheila gave back, annoyed, flicking her ears at the cyborg. "Well, maybe you should answer it," Moore suggested, leaning down to try and also get some user's insight into the phone's current status. For at least the third time today, eyes all around were pulled onto them, as the thing was making some horrible noise, even though it was just vibrating and not actually ringing. The group's borderline hysteric reactions probably didn't help with that. Shada aggressively shook her head. "We have no idea who that could even be," she pointed out, now grabbing the phone in her entire palm in order to more easily be able to wildly gesture with both arms as she spoke, made in a wide arc, with her hand still holding the vibrating annoyance. "Obviously, is somebody trying to reach the dancer?" the giant Tonasashai pointed out, having now also turned towards the commotion, his enormous head staring down toward the noisy electronic. Shada reciprocated his diminishing stare. "And just who would be calling James by now?" she asked pejoratively. "Maybe somebody he knows saw what's going on and wants to check up on him," Curie, ever the optimist, suggested perkily, shifting their body a bit higher to give expression to their hope. Shada doubted it. Who would James even know around here? Communications to his home couldn't yet be up again. Turning towards the cyborg, she got ready to give a pessimistic explanation as to why. However, she didn't get a word out when Moore already spoke up again. "It could also be James trying to reach us," the old lady pointed out, lifting an arm as she suggested it. "He gave the device to us, after all. Maybe he had something like this in mind." Shada shot around and stared up at the large, dark eyes, looking down at her candidly. Damn, she wasn't wrong. And Shada had absolutely no rebuff for that one. All the while, the damn phone was still buzzing. Pressing her eyes shut for a moment and suppressing another shake of her head, Shada exclaimed, "Oh, fine. Now how do I answer this thing?" Conglorch and Moore appeared stumped. However, Curie, who had taken the most time dealing with human technology, immediately replied, "I think you have to use the green button," and pointed at the display. Shada looked down at the small screen. Although she couldn't understand any of the writing or other symbols on it, there were indeed two buttons that clearly were meant to be easily used. However, there was one problem. "And which one of these is green?" she asked, as both buttons showed very muddled colours that she couldn't quite place. Herself and James had often gotten into discussion about what to call which precise colour, so she was basically staring at another language yet again. By now, the thing had been buzzing for so long that surely whoever was trying to reach them would be fed up and cut the connection soon, and she wasn't very confident in any of their abilities to find out how to possibly return the call. And the still ongoing, insistent buzzing didn't exactly help ease her building anxiety. "The left one," Kira replied, their voice box almost sounding like they were trying to simulate a whisper. "Alright, left." Shada lowered her finger onto the button that showed a tilted symbol that vaguely represented something like a bone, maybe? Pressing down on it, the other symbols on the screen disappeared and the button got a lot larger. However, as the loud vibrating still hadn't stopped, that was probably not the end of it yet. Luckily, the next steps were quickly cleared up by the device itself, as sideways arrows in the same colour as the button appeared next to her finger, indicating to the other side of the screen. Taking that as what she had to do, she swiped her finger in the advised direction, as the rest of her group looked on in barely contained anticipation. Shada watched as the display changed yet again, now being almost completely darkened apart from a single leftover button right in the middle of it. With it, the buzzing also died down instantly, leaving the device in an eerie silence. If she had to put money on it, she'd have guessed the remaining button would cut the connection, so she refrained from pressing it for now. Spellbound, everybody looked down at the darkened screen silently, enraptured by the now quiet device. Was something going to happen? For a moment it almost seemed like they had done something wrong. However, then Shada's ears twitched as they picked up a faint sound. "Hello?" A voice came from the tiny speakers of the device, faint enough to make it really hard to hear. "James, are you there?" Shada wasn't sure if she recognized the voice. It was so quiet, so she quickly lifted the device up closer to her ear. "Hello, James, can you hear me?" The voice spoke sweetly from the speakers once again, much louder to her ears now. And this time Shada recognized it near instantly. She hadn't heard it often, but it had left a lasting impression. As everyone who wasn't currently pressing their ear to the phone looked at her in unbridled expression, Shada quickly did something she remembered from the Earth movie, and put a hand over the area she expected the phone's microphone to be, and whisper-shouted, "It's the Leader Supreme!" Conglorch's and Moore's eyes widened slightly at the revelation, and Curie slightly tilted their body, their face remaining unmoving. Shada also stood there, eyes wide. What was she supposed to do now? However, it seemed that the movie had lied to her, because a hand over the microphone clearly wasn't enough to block out her voice, as the matriarch's voice came from the speakers once more, suspiciously asking, "I can hear you. Who is this?" Damn, too late now. Should she just hang up? The concerned eyes of her companions looking at her didn't exactly help her much with the decision. Making a call for herself, she had to press her eyes shut, took a deep breath and replied, "You've reached Aldwyn." It was the best she could come up with. "Who is this?" The Leader Supremes replied after a moment's hesitation, the sickeningly sweet tone slowly being replaced by a more and more leery one. Shada decided to play dumb. James can't come to the phone right now. He's currently indisposed, he explained, almost awkwardly, trying to give her voice some unusual inflections as she spoke. She wasn't sure if the few brief conversations she had had with the High Matriarch were enough for the Leader Supreme to remember her voice, but maybe she could try and make it less likely. But it was in vain. "Petty Officer Shada," the Matriarch expressed in a tone of voice that almost sounded like she was more detoning it for herself than relating to Shada that she knew who she was. It also carried the implication that, with that discovery, most of the goodwill she had brought to the conversation at first was quickly running dry. "How nice to hear of you again. After communications were cut and seeing that you weren't with Warrant Officer Yrrol anymore, I was starting to get worried." Yup, the venom in her voice could almost be tasted in the air. Just for a second, she'd entertained the notion of continuing to play dumb and pretending that James had somehow managed to separate Yrrol and her, and she had prioritized containing and or securing Curie afterwards. However, she not only doubted that the Zodatios would believe her for even a second, but she also had no reason to play nice with her anymore, especially after hearing that distasteful tone addressing her again. She had taken a shot, and it had missed its mark, so she was done with it. "Keep your blandishment for those who care for it, ma'am." The upstart Felina's voice came from the computer speakers, grating onto his mind. "I wouldn't be where I am if I had any need for flattery." A sharp exhale escaped to his trunk as she heard that, causing the area of the screen it was hovering over to fog up slightly. "Very well," she replied, whipping the condensation away, annoyed. "I guess it is pointless to waste good manners on you. Now tell me, why do you have James's assistant?" "Wouldn't you like to know?" The soon-to-be former petty officer replied indignantly. Just how had Ferrimore found any sort of interest in this girl? Tua had always known that the Miat would be a hassle and a half to integrate once the time would come, but the captain, may the will bless his optimism, always found it in himself to think that he could achieve it just like that. To be completely fair, there were some rare moments when his little pet project showed some promise indeed. But alas, here she was proving it a failure personally. She really hoped the poor man would be able to get over that. She had not missed that he poured his heart into this idea. Maybe she should make something happen to give him some time off after this was handled, and give him visiting rights. He would probably need to see the girl for himself to understand that his efforts had sadly been in vain. She should probably give him a call, let him know what was happening. Given that his teams didn't have that much to do, despite being activated, given that James had now chosen to act so openly, maybe they could go deal with her. Surely many of them would find that task quite agreeable. "Well, it doesn't really matter," she finally replied, realizing that she had been silent for a while. She rubbed her eyes once more, trying to think of a way to maybe reach James, now that he had given away his means of communication to this deserter. "I am far too preoccupied to waste time with you. You may be a plague, but luckily for you, you're not a priority. You will be dealt with later. Do with that information what you will." "And what if I make myself a priority?" The challenging voice of the Deathworlder sharply came out from the speakers. Tua angled her head, her ears shaking loosely next to her head. "Then you will suffer the consequences," she gleefully answered, and reached for the screen to cut the connection, not wanting to dignify this recalcitrance with another moment of her attention. But she froze in her movement, as a strange noise resounded throughout her office. It was very strange, surrounding her completely in a low drone, as whatever it was apparently got very muffled by the walls and halls surrounding her. However, at the same time, the same sound, only unobscured, also came out of the speakers of her computer, supposedly after it was picked up by the microphone on the feline's site and broadcasted over the line towards her. The deserter had also fallen quiet and was presumably just as surprised as Tua about the sudden noise, listening intently. At first it was hard to make out what exactly the noise even was, however with every moment it became clearer. It was a voice that was apparently being loudly broadcasted, not only outside of Tua's office, but also wherever the feline was situated, if not over the entire administrative area, or even worse, the entire station. The voice sounded tattered and was speaking slowly, but although it sounded superficially weak and feeble, there was an audible well of emotion bubbling up within the speaker, pushing it out with an almost palpable force behind it. And to her dismay, the voice was one that Tua was all too familiar with. What in goodness' name was that old fool thinking? "Hello? Testing? Testing? I hope I can be heard all right. It's been a while since I've had to use something like this. Oh well, I'll just have to trust in the abilities of the fine people working this device every day and making this all possible for me. They have been very lovely in granting me this opportunity, and I thank them very much. Oh dear, am I bubbling? Am I not? Apologies, it is hard to stay focused when you have so much going on inside you. I should probably get to my point. I sincerely hope you can hear me, James. Although, I think Ambassador Aldwin is probably more fitting right now, as you probably don't want me addressing you so informally at the moment, which I understand. I just wanted to let you know some things. Or, well, I guess I just didn't want to leave them unsaid. Although now that I'm here, I have to admit that I don't quite know where to start. I waited a long time for this day. Somebody like you might not even imagine just how long. It was hard. Hoping against hope that, even though I had already waited for so many days, waiting just one more would always be worth it. Hard to not think. Has it been enough days already? But even so, I have managed to hold on. Often have I imagined for myself just how I would act when the day finally comes. The day that those I had waited for so long would appear before me. How would I approach them? What would I even say? And how would they react? I will admit that, in my old years, I may have given in to my own fantasies a bit too much. I may have let what I imagined consume me to the point where I wasn't able to handle what was reality anymore, and I only realized it once it was too late. None of this should have happened like it has. We've made mistakes, but now I realize we have to be greater than them. I cannot claim to know what is going through your mind right now, and I will be honest and say that what lies ahead now scares me. It scares me that after all this time, we might have quickly broken what we waited for so long for. But like I believed for all those years, I still believe now. Believe that we can yet mend what threatens to break. The dream I've harbored for so long can still become reality, even if not in the precise way I imagined for so long. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, please, see reason. I don't know where you are right now, or what exactly you are doing, but I hope at least this much reaches you. We can clear all of this up. There is no need to let things get any more out of hand. I will do what I can for you. So please, see reason. For all of us. We have waited so long. With the unmistakable sound of feed cutting out the broadcast that had echoed through the entirety of the GCS and had made life stop in its tracks for a second, as all its residents had raised their heads and looked up for a moment, was then interrupted. Many wondered who was speaking, as only a few recognised the councilman's voice from having heard it on news broadcasts. Many more wondered what it was all about. Just who was this Ambassador Aldwin? Why did he need to see reason? And what was it that the councilman, and with him his mysterious we, had waited for so long? Some remained puzzled, the mystery occupying their mind for hours or even days to come. Some felt that maybe the old man had simply lost his mind in his late years. Others simply didn't let it bother them and went on with their life, leaving it for others, who had more time or resources to figure it out. However, there were those few deeper down, those who had some vestiges of knowledge, making them listen up more carefully at some of the things being said. Those who knew even more, questioning the intentions of the message and just how much weight they should put on what had been said. And lastly, those few in the know, those chosen, or maybe just unlucky people who understood exactly what was being said and what it could mean. Each of them now having to deal with this turn of events for themselves, and each making their own call about what must happen now. And among them was also the one who had been spoken to, the very person the message was addressed towards. It had indeed reached them. Although it was in a situation where maybe he wasn't all too receptive towards it. Jane spun to the side, letting the man-catcher that was thrust at him with a wild war cry go right past him as he sidestepped around the large man, who was still carried forward by his momentum and reacted only slowly to James's movement. He evaded two more attempts by different security forces in a similar way, twirling and ducking out of the way of the massive, thick rods designed to hold down and control people much larger than himself. The ambush had happened suddenly, and for the first moments of it, he could only react, as he had to recover from being caught flat-footed. The only bit of breathing room he managed to immediately secure for himself was the fact that the guards didn't seem to expect him to completely ignore their orders of, "Stand down or we will shoot." Seeing as he treated their lethal weapons as non-entities, some of them had to scramble to reach for something they were actually allowed to use, as clearly intimidation wasn't working on him. James had to counter one last attempt at his mobility, performed by the first man to try and grab him again, by simply jumping up and landing on top of the man-catcher. He wasn't sure if the man would have usually been able to hold his weight. However, the leverage on the long weapon wasn't playing to his favour, and so James's weight dragged the polearm's tip to the floor, where the man uselessly pulled on it for a bit, unable to free it from under James's feet, until James simply stepped off of it, going for his next target. The moment of breath he had managed to gain by that had been enough to quickly yank the Martian Mameluke from his sheath, which came in handy as he used it to let another thrust slide off his flat side after yet another sidestep. as there was so much mass behind the massive rod, he had to support the blade against his shoulder, so as to not let it simply be knocked aside. A hail of rubber bullets impacted heavily with his torso, managing to stagger him for a second. It was less the impacts themselves and more the fact that some of them hit already injured areas, punching against his bruises and burns, with resulting pain stunning him at first. Those feeling that they were too close to him took a step back. He had pulled a weapon, so they wanted to gain some distance, while also brandishing their own armaments, including more rubber bullets, and of course tasers. They were smart enough to not even attempt to go for their pepper spray, as long as James was wearing a protective face mask. That didn't mean they were not carrying them, however, just that they didn't pull them out. He sharply sucked in a lungful of breath through his teeth, not looking forward to what was coming next. He felt like he had already gotten shocked more than enough for one day, if not for an entire lifetime, but he didn't see any way past this situation without having to endure at least one more taser shot. He wondered if this was bad for his heart, and concluded that it probably was, but didn't have time to think any more of it, as he already noticed the telltale motion of aim being taken by the three foremost security guards, while the rest of their team provided something akin to covering fire, and his ingrained muscle memory of aim dodging kicked in. He couldn't evade every shot, but enough that he would hopefully be able to power through the current. If all of them hit him, it would be game over. Hopefully he was still up to the task. As he burst forward, he couldn't exactly tell how many of the fired electrodes pierced his skin. He only felt the impact, then the pain, and then his body still moving forward as he willed it, in that one direction as hard as he could. Current flowed through his body, and even more bullets impacted him, but he kept on going, a cocktail of stimulants and painkillers alike flowing through his veins, as all he could see was his target. The guards' reaction times weren't quite up to par, as they noticed too late that somehow their most likely supersonic projectiles had missed their mark, and those that didn't failed in their task. Now yelling out a wild war cry of himself, James brought his arm around, while swinging the sword almost berserker-like, and hoping that he wouldn't miss. A necessary risk he didn't like to take. But before he could even doubt whether or not he hit his mark, the effect was already there. With a metal clank, followed a near-deafening hissing sound. A sudden sheer force almost took the sword right out of James's hand, as his arm was finally burst backwards, and sent him stumbling a few steps back, struggling to regain his footing. His vision was covered in a red-orange, as the air around him was filled with the chemicals that had been so explosively ejected from his pressure container, and now started to only slowly settle down as a fine residue all around him. The depressurization had been a lot more violent than James had expected, and for a moment he pondered whether the danger had been worth it. A false move, and that could have probably taken his arm, or at least incapacitated it. Even now, with things having gone well, he could feel his joints pulsating, after they had to compensate for the sudden, unnatural force crashing against them. Oh well, at least the explosion also had the intended effect, as the entire squad of guards was reduced to a whimpering, spitting mess, curling themselves on the floor. And couldn't be long from now that they would simply stop carrying the spray, as he was sure. Luckily he knew firsthand that info like that travelled only slowly through the chain of command. Still, he couldn't use them as his plan much longer. He tilted his head, and kept doing so until he felt resistance. Then he overcame that resistance, loosening up his nape with a loud crack. That he used his already mace-covered sleeve to first wipe off the view of his mask, and then clean the sword's blade. To his delight and slight surprise, the edge had actually survived the violent impact, with the can visibly unscathed. With a sense of strange satisfaction, he let the blade glide back into its sheath, and shook out his still aching arm before turning around. "You okay?" Yrrol asked into the seeming emptiness. It took a moment for a reaction to follow, but slowly. Repri's head emerged out of the wall's gap he had been hiding behind, concealing his presence to the point James actually doubted for a moment if he was still there. "Seeing as I wasn't part of this mess, yes," Repri answered, his snark being slightly undercut by the way he stared at the incapacitated squad of giants. Maybe his certainty of James coming to turn himself in was cracking ever so slightly at the sight. Not that it really mattered. "Come on, we don't have all day," James said, waving the rodent along as he continued on his way in the direction they had been going before the ambush. He noticed that Repri's eyes didn't yet tear away from the pitiful sight, so he silently added, "They'll be fine. It's their own stuff after all." "How did they even get up here?" Repri gasped, as he uncertainly sneaked up to James, his wary eyes darting between the guards and the edge of the roof all of this had taken place on. After the track of the suspension railway had become too inconvenient of a path to travel towards their destination, James had instead taken to run across the roofs of the buildings lining each walkway and street within the GTS-like walls, making it quite easy to use them as improvised paths, as long as one had the right physical abilities. "I'm guessing they climbed," James dismissed the question, trying to clean even more of the sticky chemicals off his visor with his gunky sleeve to limited success. He then took a bit of a run-up, as the next building was taller than the current one, and he had to scale the difference. Once he managed to just about pull himself up there, he already turned to extend a hand, as Repri may have been built for super high gravity, but he wasn't exactly made for climbing. "Say, can I ask you something?" Reprique spoke up, as James was busy pulling him over the edge of the surplus. James deeply exhaled. You've been doing nothing else for quite a while, he replied resignedly, already beginning to power walk towards the next roof. Well, first of all, Reprique continued, seemingly pretending to not notice James's annoyed undertone. Are you just going to ignore that? The message, I mean? Yup, James replied, emphasizing the P with a popping sound of his lips. No reaction at all, Reprique tried to clarify, taking quick, small steps while hurrying alongside James to try and remain on one level with him. Nope, James replied again, giving it the same pizzazz. Reprique seemingly wanted to respond something, but apparently couldn't find the right words, so James took it upon himself to answer his unasked question. Listen, whatever Kashalangas wants, it literally doesn't matter to me, he grumbled, while also starting to huff and puff slightly, as his adrenaline died down once again. I'm opening the door for our ship, and then I'm out of here. I have absolutely no interest in talking to anybody. Reprique acknowledged that with a contemplative sound. A nice bit of silence followed, during which the warrant officer's mind seemed to be working. James relished that moment. However, it soon came to an end again, as Reprique all of a sudden commented, You know, you are pretty reckless if that is your goal. Groaning and starting to rub his shoulder incessantly, James inquired, How so? Reprique made a sound that sounded almost like snorting, but not quite. Well, those people had weapons aimed at you, he explained bemusedly. I know you think they aren't allowed to fire at you, but what if you're wrong? And even if they aren't allowed to, what makes you think none of them will do it anyway? If you get yourself shot, how are you going to open that door? James, who now slowly rotated his shoulder as the aching and pounding was slowly getting more and more intense, casually replied, Well, the way I see it, there are two options. Either I'm right, and I don't get shot, or I'm wrong, and it's not my problem anymore, in which case I had a good run. Reprique suddenly stopped in place, looking at James wide-eyed. James also stopped, gazing back at the man. What, too dark for you? He asked, with a tilt of his head. No, I'm just concerned that I don't find that answer concerning anymore, Reprique replied aghast, looking as if he was seriously contemplating his life at that moment. James shrugged it off and already wanted to continue onwards, when he was suddenly stopped by just missing a step and suddenly tipping forwards, catching himself with a large lunge and stumbling to a more stable stance, his hands on his knees and breathing heavily. Apparently standing still for a moment had signalled his body that a drop in energy was manageable all of a sudden, and his system had obliged all too happily. His pain receptors came to life in a cacophony of stimuli, and he started coughing as his breath became unsteady. Hey, all right, Reprique said, his voice sounding surprisingly honest given their situation. You don't look so good. No kidding, James replied sarcastically. I'm feeling like $1,000,000 over here. As he didn't have the motivation to look up at him, he would have to manage with imagining Reprique's reaction to that. Biting his lips and clenching his fists, James started to push himself to stand straight again, stretching his limbs and calming his breathing. Despite the pain, he suddenly managed to find his center once more, bring his mind back to a place of control, in spite of his screaming body. It almost seems like I'll be able to bring you in myself by now, Reprique commented with a hint of mockery in his voice that wasn't befitting of the position he was in. James turned his head, glaring at the man. Of course, Reprique wouldn't be able to see through his mask, but he hoped the gesture was obvious anyway. You want to try it? He offered challengingly, completely ready to push himself as much as it took to put his former shadow in his place. Reprique, however, calmly shook his head. James's condition almost seemed to invigorate him in a way. I've no need to rush things, he explained. I already told you multiple times you're doing my work for me. Oh, shut up, James replied, his calm state of mind cracking for a second. Reprique dismissed him with a wiggle of his trunk and then walked over, towards the edge of the roof, but the street was at least something like 40 meters under them. Well, either way, you can probably afford to take a moment for yourself right now, he pondered, while looking down at the street, leaning slightly over the foreboding border to a quick demise. We're almost there, so if you ever want to think about how you'll actually be getting inside, now will be the time. James perked up at that. They were this close already? Damn, was that even enough time? They'd gotten it faster than he'd expected. Would the others make it to the ship in time? The only way to check for that was when it would already be too late should it not be the case. Should he wait? But if he waited too long, he could also be endangering them, but making them also wait, making them a potential target. He had to think. He had to make a decision. And the pounding pain radiating throughout his body wasn't helping. He didn't even know how much he still had in him. One last push, maybe two, or even less than that. It depended on what he was up against. And the longer he waited, the more that would be. They weren't exactly hidden, after all, and it wouldn't go unnoticed that they had stopped. Soon people would flock to their position. It would make taking any action an unquantifiable amount harder, if not flat out impossible. No. Since the moment he had decided to travel well out in the open, he had to move fast. He He would just have to trust that either the others were at the ship already, or he would be able to stall long enough that they could make it after he was already in. There were no other options, so he would have to succeed. At least he told himself that. For now, Raprig was right. He would have to find a sensible way in. Of course, one of the obvious solutions was gun, but unless he pointed it in the right direction, that could be a lot less effective than he wished it to be. Seeing as Raprig had been really quiet for a while now, James decided to check on what exactly had shut him up all of a sudden, so he also carefully walked over towards the roof edge, looking down onto the movement on the streets below. Of course, some of the security forces that had been on their trail for a while now were already there, and would have to be dealt with. That much was to be expected. However, even from all the way up here, his human eyesight, sharp and programmed to look for familiar faces and patterns, immediately stuck to a different figure, with a much more noticeable identifier than the usual guards. What is he doing here? James whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. However, Raprig took it upon himself to answer anyway. We've been travelling in the open. I guess he's just been going along with us for a while now, he suspected. It would make sense. After all, he was already overseeing this operation personally. Yeah, you're right, James mused thoughtfully. So many ideas were starting to form in his mind as he kept staring down at the unmoving face of Captain Faramore Uton himself.